Jallianwalla Bagh massacre occurred on April 13, 1919 and took place in Amritsar, India during British rule over India. The exact location was in a large walled garden close to the Sikh Golden Temple. A crowd of over 10,000 ordinary Sikh men, women, and children were gathered in the large walled garden to celebrate the major festival of Baisakhi, which marks the end of the harvest season. In addition, during the festival, many citizens also protested against the Rowlatt Act, which was issued in March of 1919 and allowed British soldiers to arrest any person without having a trial, and was a major cause of the massacre and many protests. The commander of the British troop, named General Dyer, issued the order for the soldiers to open fire on the unarmed Sikh crowd, which led to an estimated 379 to 1,000 people dead. This massacre was a huge problem because it showed the brutal act of violence the British showed against civilians and expressed that they would do anything to keep ruling over India. Furthermore, the soldiers escalated the massacre to a major issue by firing until they ran out of ammo, which led to a scar in India-British relations. The Jallianwalla Bagh massacre occurred on April 13, 1919. It changed public opinion against British rule and accelerated India's independence movement by showing the brutal force of the British, increased Indian supporters causing more protest, and motivated Indian citizens to step up. At 5 o'clock, Dyer arrived to Amritsar with his 90 men. When Dyer issued the order for his soldiers to fire at the large crowd, an estimated 379 innocent Indian civilians were killed. Also, around 1,200 more were wounded during the massacre. The brutality of the British was shown here by expressing their anger and killing hundreds of innocent people. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom during 1940 to 1945 and during 1951 to 1955, made very degenerate remarks on Indians directed towards Gandhi and other Indian nationalists. He stated, "It is alarming and astonishing to see Mr. Gandhi, a seditious Middle Temple lawyer, now posing as a Hindu, striding half-naked up the steps of the Viceregal Palace." But on July 8th of 1920, over a year after the massacre happened, Churchill expressed his thoughts of the massacre by stating, "One of the worst, most dreadful outrages in the whole of our history. Since the massacre was so outrageous, even a man like Churchill condemned Dyer's action." Continuing, the Jallianwalla Bagh massacre had many different viewpoints. A prime example we have been talking about is Winston Churchill. He argued the massacre was a monstrous event and did not like the action of the British. Furthermore, 3 days before the horrific massacre occurred, 2 Indian nationalists named Dr. Satyapal and Dr. Kichlu were arrested without a trial, according to the Rowlatt Act, because of leading protests against British rule in Amritsar, India. Since British officials disliked these acts, they decided to arrest them so protests in Amritsar would be extinct. Despite this, the arrest of these nationalists led to even more protests and the Jallianwalla Bagh massacre. The British brutality was shown in this situation because they did not want Indians to share their personal views on the Indian independence movement, and they did not want more people to join the movement. After the massacre, General Dyer admitted the brutality of the British by stating, "It was a horrible duty to perform, but I think it was a merciful thing." The words of Dyer himself, the criminal who left 379 citizens dead. Even the man who committed the massacre admitted his savagery and viciousness. Though the massacre did change public opinion against the British, some people still stuck with the British Raj, including General Dyer. During his court sentence, he stated, "If more troops had been at hand, the casualties would be greater in proportion. It was no longer a question of merely dispersing the crowd, but one of producing a sufficient morale effect from a military point of view." This quote from him shows that he still sided with the British and believed that they should still take rule over India, and disagreed with my claim. The mass murder was a significant turning point on India-British relationships in a negative way because it left an untrustworthy scar on it. Also, it ruined many other countries' relationships with Great Britain, including Egypt, Canada, and Ireland. Nationalist leader Eamon de Valera called the massacre a deliberate butchery of innocent people. After General Dyer and his soldiers slaughtered hundreds of Indians, many citizens shared the same outrage which united them with their shared grief, even though they had religious differences. News of the massacre spread very quickly and led to many organized prayers,
which he describes as an event which stands in singular and sinister isolation, which basically is the rotten apple argument, which we find so often whenever there's I'm sort of reaching widely in the analogies. Whenever there's a white supremacist attack, it's a lone wolf.
Moving on, the Indian Nationalist Congress, which was a political party who advocated for Indian independence, had a major increase in support after the Jallianwalla Bagh massacre. Before the massacre, citizens were very hesitant to join the movement, but after the tragedy India suffered, they were motivated to fight for self-rule. But after the massacre, it united all Indians and their supporters, even though it was a very painful chapter of India. After the horrific massacre, protests skyrocketed, including Gandhi's non-cooperation movement. From 10 to 50 million people participated in boycotting the British and in non-violent protests. This led to immense pressure on the British government and a crucial role in India gaining independence in 1947. Also, it was a turning point in India's amount of supporters. Following the Jallianwalla Bagh massacre, a poet named Rabindranath Tagore, an Indian citizen, wrote many poems and was the first poet to win the Nobel Prize for Literature that was not a European. An excerpt from one of his poems is, "Where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls." This excerpt from one of Tagore's poems shows he was motivated by the Jallianwalla Bagh massacre to write the poem because before this event, he focused on poems about God. Another prime example of someone stepping up is Mahatma Gandhi. Before the massacre during 1919, he spent time in Africa during the early 1900s by leading ambulance corps and nonviolent resistant movements. When coming back to India in 1915, he traveled India and promoted national unity. After the news of the massacre, Gandhi established the non-cooperation movement over a year after the massacre during August 1st, 1920. The movement was to have Indians repeal cooperation with the British government, and the goal was for India to be self-governed. Historians estimate 10 to 50 million people participated in the movement, and some large figures included Motilal Nehru, an Indian lawyer, and Lala Lajpat Rai, another Indian nationalist leader. This shows the horrific massacre fueled millions of citizens to peacefully fight for freedom and was a turning point in India's independence movement because the citizens and many leaders had motivation to gain back independence and by putting in the effort. By Gandhi leading many protests after the massacre, this shows the massacre was a pivotal event in India's race for independence. Going ahead, an example of an event that did not motivate citizens to step up against the British was the Indian Rebellion of 1857. Indian soldiers who worked with the East India Company, who traded with Asia, disliked the working conditions and how the British treated them. So, on May 10th of 1857, Indian soldiers fired on British officers, then marched to Delhi, India, and made Badar Shah Zafar their Mughal emperor or leader. The news spread to different parts of India, including Agra and Kanpur, and many more people joined the Indian soldiers. After the defeats the British suffered, they used their power to kill the rebels. By 1859, the Mughal emperor Zafar was exiled to Burma and British rule was back again. After the massive rebellion, no long-term effects came for India after it. On the other hand, the Jallianwalla Bagh massacre did cause leaders to step up and did have long-term effects of finally leading India to independence on August 15th of 1947. Many women who witnessed the massacre in Amritsar played a crucial role by providing aid to injured people. The horrific events unfolding in front of their eyes motivated them to step up by showing their courage and resilience. The Jallianwalla Bagh massacre was a turning point in India's independence movement because the citizens had motivation to gain back independence after the massacre. The Jallianwalla Bagh massacre on April 13, 1919 was a monstrous event in which the British showed their brutal force against innocent civilians, which lessened trust in the British government and the largest event for India to succeed in the race for independence. The massacre in Amritsar was the most significant event in India's independence movement because without it, India would not have the motivation to fight back against the British. In addition to this, all the hard work India put in, they finally gained back independence in 1947, put a scar on India-British relations, and is a powerful reminder of India's resistance and injustices. Finally, the relations between India and Great Britain were broken because of the loss in trust in their government, widespread international condemnation, and immediate protest led by Indian nationalists.